Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. Gloria Anzaldúa, Borderlands, La Frontera. Borders are a central theme in the 21st century. Borders dividing nations, political parties, citizens from non-citizens, along racial and gender lines, manifesting in ideologies that materialize in discussions about walls, border surveillance, and containment. However, as illuminated by Anzaldúa, while a border may be a dividing line that sustains colonial difference of us versus them, the borderlands are porous and fluid, as most notable in the vulnerability that we are all experiencing in the face of global pandemic. Borders are both ideological and physical and are being created and sustained during global pandemic, where the global community is inhabiting a range of borders, the borders that separate the private from the public, between countries, between bodies. And many are seeking to cross these as we physically distance, yet socially connect. In reflecting on borders and homes, I'm reminded that for many, the home is a dangerous place. In the introduction of Migrant Crossings, I began with a discussion of Latinx migration, where migrants are bound to being seen as criminals, in spite of many being refugees seeking asylum, fleeing conditions of human trafficking, sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and even attempted murder, or seeking work opportunities. I examine how migrants are shaped by the contradictions, where some migrants are seen as ideal victims, whereas others are relegated to criminality and deportability. Today, for the Sex, Gender, and Women's Health Across the Lifespan conference, I invite conference participants to embark on new modalities of witnessing, a form of witnessing I call an unsettled witnessing. An unsettled witnessing is a commitment to witnessing without being settled with what one is seeing. Unlike spectators, witnesses are called to action. The necessary actions in unsettled witnessing facilitates are raising questions about the normative aspects of events and examining the politics of representation with regards to victimhood, criminality, citizenship, and legality as infused with a discourse of nationhood, race, and gender. This type of witnessing facilitates seeing a person for their complex personhood beyond narratives that construct them as other, victim or criminal, and a subject to be pitied. For survivors of violence, the home can be a contested site of violence, of both neglect and resistance. As the public shelters in place and are appealed to physically distance, questions that I'm responding to today is, how does one witness that which occurs behind closed doors or in places that are rendered invisible, beyond that which is knowable? How may an unsettled witnessing facilitate the creation of connections, theoretical and in practice? Here, the witnesses are multiple: social welfare workers, social service providers, shelter providers, healthcare workers, law enforcement, dispatch, fire, educators, community-based organizers, survivors, families, and friends. Just very quickly, to define gender-based violence is understood as violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or physiological harm or suffering, or a combination based on a person's gender, coercion, or arbitrary deprivations of freedom that occurs publicly or in private life. Gender is complex and a multi-level construct, and I think our colleague earlier, Lisa Diamond, did a wonderful job of thinking through this. And just to add to the conversation, drawing upon Maria Lugones' work, is that gender as a system is a colonial concept. For today's presentation, I'm sharing from a range of places, drawing upon what we call in ethnic studies bricolage methodologies, in which I'm bringing in different sites of study, from looking at legal complaints, interviews in San Francisco, interviews in Salt Lake City, and observations that I conducted in New Orleans and South Dakota. And so that informs today's presentation. So there is an ideological, political, and social border that relegates the domestic sphere of the home to the private. However, pandemic is teaching us that events that occur in the home cannot be contained to the private, where the private and the public boundary is fluid, where gender-based violence cuts across both the state and individuals. During global pandemic, domestic abuse around the world is seen as on the rise, where cities in the United States are witnessing an increase in calls to 911 dispatch with regards to domestic violence. As the public is appealed to shelter in place, many survivors are forced into isolation with their abusers, where domestic violence is a reality for many. The home can be a place of violence. In Migrant Crossings, multiple chapters examine case examples of trafficking of domestic workers. I examine a case study of a Peruvian woman trafficked into domestic servitude by a Mania Peruvian, Filipinas trafficked into sexual slavery, as well as domestic work, where the traffickers included people who were migrants, US citizens, ranging in professions from a law enforcement agent, school teacher, to real estate agent, and a lawyer. While there has been attention to domestic violence on the rise, multiple forms of abuse and vulnerability are apparent, where one's documented status, race, and gender relegates them to work in dangerous conditions. For some, working in conditions where they are locked in with their abusers. On the other hand, they also experience neglect. As conveyed by Agent Hu, domestic workers have not received the applause other essential workers have received, despite being on the front lines of the fight against coronavirus. Their work, by definition, takes place in someone else's home. Working from home is not an option. Migrants are central to social, political, and economic life in the United States, with the majority of migrants arriving from Asian and Latin America. As anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy, as anti-Asian rhetoric and policy, I lost my spot, it is being furthered during pandemic, some would describe migrants as unsung heroes who labor to provide the needed food and services for those who are able to shelter in place. Prior to pandemic, migrants were already sheltering in place out of fear of authorities and due to anti-immigrant sentiment. As 2020 is filled with people who are able to shelter in place, home as an unsafe zone requires recognition that prior to COVID-19 and during pandemic, a range of abuses occurred in the privacy of people's homes, from child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and even human trafficking. The dehumanization survivors experience and witnesses see are complex as people rescue their dignity through disaster capitalism. For the survivor of violence, their dehumanization and denial of human dignity is normalized. And here's a quote from a Salt Lake City law enforcement agent who conveyed, quote, "I talked to one girl whose mother locked her in the garage where she used kitty litter as a bathroom. What do I do with her? I don't send her back to her house. She doesn't have a home." So that is another reason why they don't want to talk on their trafficker, because their trafficker is essentially, in their minds, giving them a better life. All they have to do is have sex with these strangers, and they can have all these other things in return, end quote. While the domestic work sphere can be a place of violence and danger for some, it can also be a place in which we radically alter society. And here I'm appreciating Bell Hooks, in which she says that houses belong to women, where their special domain not as property, but as places where all that truly mattered in life took place: the warmth and comfort of shelter, the feeding of our bodies, the nurturing of our souls. And so for Bell Hooks, the home can be a site of resistance. As illuminated in interviews I conducted in 2018, where I interviewed people who'd experienced gender-based violence regarding sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and human trafficking in San Francisco, for survivors of gender-based violence, their safety is dependent on having access to housing. And so here there's a couple of quotes in which a shelter provider talks about how safety is tied to housing, right? And then another quote in which an advocate talks about housing being so important, it's a basic need, right? And so I think we can all agree that housing is important. And for some survivors, pandemic is exposing for some survivors, that pandemic is exposing they are willing to risk living in abusive conditions to have a place to stay or for the care of other family members and pets. And so there's a need to move towards a collective responsibility regarding housing access for survivors of gender-based violence. In 2019, I began doing these follow-up with a summit, housing summits with organizations in South Dakota, in Sioux Falls, as well as in New Orleans. And some of the things that we were learning is that there's a range of issues that were interconnected and so complex, from polyvictimization, organizations themselves experiencing compassion fatigue, as well as a range of abuses that people are experiencing because human trafficking is so complex, from related issues from labor abuse, conditions related to that, to sexual abuse. The list goes on, as well as from just having basic needs deprived. And so, to conclude, I'm going to move toward thinking around collective responsibility, and addressing multifaceted needs. I think that this is really important, that in order the response to gender-based violence, forms of violence, requires grappling with the complex through coalitional work. And so here's a couple more quotes from Salt Lake City as well as from San Francisco that shows the interconnectedness of issues regarding housing, to a range of connected issues. And so while I focus this paper on this presentation on housing and the home, oftentimes to address gender-based violence requires grappling with a myriad of issues simultaneously. As the interviewees conveyed, survivors of violence have a range of needs. As many of us who do research, teach, and are practitioners regarding gender-based violence, solving a societal problem like gender-based violence means that while I may focus on a particular site, such as the home, in today's presentation, I cannot separate examining the home from economies that create the home and sustain what one needs in their home. From the social and cultural life that is tethered to the home, such as food, health, community, belief systems, and the politics of laws that shape who has access to a place they can call home, and the public health and physiological and psychological needs one has to occupy a space or a place they call home. So that to enact an unsettled witnessing of gender-based violence is to be moved towards actions that seek to centralize the complex. And therefore, to take seriously these multiple ways of knowing, I invite the community of Utah to join the University of Utah's Gender-Based Violence Consortium, which was soft launched this spring. And really, it was imagined as a space, a collective space, to create a sense of home for thinkers, practitioners, and scholars to convene together regarding an affinity issue of gender-based violence, so that we can create an interprofessional network regarding an issue, a 21st century crisis of gender-based violence. And so just to share, if you want to get my book, want to read more about what I have written about, you can get a discount. You can visit this link, 20% discount with my last name, Fukushima. Here's some other articles that I recently published that relates to human trafficking and health issues, in which I talk about food deprivation. I also talk about border surveillance and technologies that impact migrants, human rights-based approaches, as well as recently did a study with colleagues and a student of mine on the multiplicity of stigma. And this study was in particular focused on Salt Lake City in Utah. And so here you can join our listserv. I will share the Prezi link with folks in the chat box. But you can join our listserv, or you can email me your questions directly.